The stars had never looked so beautiful to Ambassador Elena Vasquez as they did through the viewport of her diplomatic shuttle, and she took a deep breath as the massive space station came into view ahead of her, its golden spires stretching outward like the branches of some ancient cosmic tree that had grown for thousands of years in the cold emptiness between worlds. The station was called the Eternal Accord, and it served as the capital of the Galactic Council, a coalition of 47 alien species that had ruled this part of the galaxy for over 12,000 years before humanity had even learned to make fire. And now Elena was about to become the first human to set foot inside its legendary halls. "Ambassador, we are cleared for docking," her pilot announced. And Elena nodded slowly while smoothing the front of her formal uniform, the deep blue fabric marked with the golden emblem of the United Terran Federation, a symbol of everything humanity had achieved since first venturing beyond their small blue world. She had trained her entire life for this moment, spending decades learning alien languages and customs and diplomatic protocols, all so she could stand before the most powerful beings in the galaxy and ask them to give humanity a chance, to see past their youth and recognize the potential that burned within every human heart. The docking clamps locked into place with a heavy metallic sound, and Elena walked toward the airlock with steady steps, her heart beating fast, but her face showing nothing but calm confidence, because she knew that countless eyes would be watching her from this moment forward, and she could not afford to show any weakness. The doors opened, and she stepped onto the station. The first thing she noticed was the silence, a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow every sound she made. And as she walked down the long corridor toward the council chamber, she saw aliens of every shape and size watching her from the shadows, their strange eyes following her with expressions she could not read but suspected were not friendly. A tall creature with silver scales and 4 arms appeared before her, its voice cold and formal as it said, "I am Counselor Threekoval, and I will escort you to the chamber, human. Though I must warn you that the council has little patience for speeches from primitive species." Elena smiled politely and replied, "Then I will try not to waste their time, Counselor." The walk to the chamber took nearly an hour, and Elena suspected this was intentional, designed to make her feel small and insignificant as she passed through hall after hall of ancient monuments and trophies from conquered worlds, each one a reminder that the council had been building empires while humanity was still living in caves. Finally, they reached the great doors, massive slabs of metal covered in symbols from 100 different languages. And as they swung open, Elena saw the council for the first time. They sat in a circular arrangement, 47 different species on 47 different thrones, each one more alien than the last. And at the center of them all sat High Arbiter Zeeth Kalan of the Vorthani Dominion, his pale blue skin and black eyes giving him the appearance of a corpse that had somehow learned to speak. "You may approach." "Human," Zeeth Kalan said, his voice echoing through the chamber like thunder rolling across distant mountains. "And you may make your case, though I will tell you now that the council has already made its decision regarding your kind." Elena walked to the center of the room and stood before them without fear, her voice clear and strong as she began to speak. "Honored members of the Galactic Council, I come before you today not as a conqueror or a threat, but as a representative of a species that wishes only to take its place among the stars alongside you, to trade and learn and grow together, to face the challenges of this vast universe, not as enemies, but as allies." She spoke of human history, of the wars they had fought and the lessons they had learned, of the art and music and literature that had flourished even in their darkest hours, of the scientists who had unlocked the secrets of the atom, and the dreamers who had first looked up at the stars and wondered what might be waiting for them there. She spoke of the Void Reapers, the extragalactic threat that everyone in the council feared, but no one wanted to discuss openly. And she offered humanity's strength and determination to help fight against them, to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Council's forces and defend this galaxy that they all called home. When she finished, there was silence in the chamber, and for a brief moment, Alano allowed herself to hope that her words had reached them, that somewhere behind those alien eyes, there was understanding and perhaps even respect. But then Zeth Kalen began to laugh. It was a cold and terrible sound, like ice cracking on a frozen lake, and one by one the other council members joined him, their various forms of laughter filling the chamber with a noise that made Elena's blood run cold. "You think we need your help, human?" Zeth Kalen asked, his black eyes gleaming with contempt. "You think we fear the Void Reapers enough to ally ourselves with primitives from a death world, creatures who have been traveling between stars for less than a century, who still fight among themselves over patches of dirt and outdated ideas?" He leaned forward on his throne, and his voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "We have watched your species, Ambassador, and we have seen what you truly are: violent, aggressive, and completely incapable of existing peacefully with others. And we have decided that you will never be allowed to spread your chaos across our galaxy." Elena felt her heart sink, but she kept her voice steady as she replied, "High Arbiter, I assure you that humanity has changed, that we have learned from our past mistakes, and silence." Zeth Kalen roared, rising from his throne with fury burning in his eyes. "You dare to speak of peace while your own agents spread sedition among our lesser species, encouraging them to rise up against the natural order that has maintained stability for 12,000 years? "I do not know what you are talking about," Elena said, confusion and fear beginning to crack her composure. "I have done nothing, but we have evidence of your crimes, Ambassador. Evidence that proves you have been working to undermine Council authority since the moment your species made first contact with us." Guards appeared from the shadows, their weapons pointed at Elena's chest, and she realized with horrible clarity that this had been the plan all along, that they had never intended to listen to her words, that everything she had worked for her entire life had been nothing but a trap. "Elena Vasquez of Earth," Zeth Kalen declared, his voice booming through the chamber as recording devices broadcast his words to every world in the Council's domain. "You are hereby found guilty of galactic sedition, and you are sentenced to death by molecular dissolution, a sentence that will be carried out immediately as a warning to all primitive species who forget their place in this galaxy." Elena did not beg for mercy, and she did not cry, and as the guards dragged her toward the execution platform, she managed to activate the hidden transmitter in her uniform, sending one final message to Earth before the signal was cut. "Do not mourn me," she said, her voice steady even as the dissolution field began to glow around her. "Remember me." And then Ambassador Elena Vasquez was gone, her body scattered into atoms that drifted away like dust in a cold and uncaring wind, while across the galaxy, humanity watched in horror and grief, and something ancient and terrible began to wake within them, something that the Council had never seen before and would soon learn to fear more than anything they had ever encountered in 12,000 years of ruling the stars. For 72 hours after the execution of Ambassador Elena Vasquez, humanity said nothing at all, and the silence that fell across human space was so complete and so absolute that it seemed as if every man, woman, and child had simply stopped breathing at the same moment. The Council watched and waited. Their spies and sensors pointed toward Earth and its colonies, expecting to see panic and chaos, and the desperate scrambling of a primitive species that had just learned how small and powerless it truly was in the vast darkness of the galaxy. But there was no panic, and there was no chaos, and the Council's observers reported back with growing confusion that the humans were not running, or hiding, or begging for forgiveness. They were simply going about their daily lives as if nothing had happened. As if the murder of their ambassador meant nothing to them at all, High Arbiter Zeth Kalen smiled when he heard these reports, believing that humanity had accepted its place, that the execution had broken their spirit, just as he had intended. And he told his fellow council members that the human problem had been solved, that there was no need to worry about these primitives ever again. He could not have been more wrong, deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a bunker that had been built in secret over the course of decades. Fleet Admiral James Okonkwo stood before the War Council of the United Terran Federation, his dark eyes burning with a fury so cold and so controlled that everyone who saw him felt a chill run down their spine. The War Council was made up of the highest military commanders from every branch of the Terran armed forces, along with the leaders of every human colony world and the most brilliant strategic minds that humanity had ever produced. And they had been gathered here for one purpose, and one purpose only. You have all seen the broadcast, Admiral Okonkwo said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. You have all watched as they murdered our ambassador, a woman who came to them with nothing but hope and goodwill. And you have all heard the words of High Arbiter Zeth Kalen, as he called us primitives and threatened to destroy our entire species if we dared to challenge the Council's authority. He paused and looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. The question before us now is simple. How do we respond? One by one, the members of the War Council rose and spoke their minds, and though their words were different, their message was the same. A message that had been building in human hearts since the moment they watched Elena Vasquez dissolve into nothing on screens across the galaxy war. They said, total and complete and without mercy. War until the Council understood that humanity would not be intimidated or conquered or erased from the universe. War until every being in the galaxy knew that to harm a human was to invite destruction upon yourself and everything you held dear. Vote was unanimous. Admiral Okonkwo nodded slowly and then turned to a console behind him, entering a code that only he and the President of the Federation knew, a code that had been created for this very moment, for the day when humanity would need to reveal its true strength to the galaxy. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, allow me to introduce you to Project Prometheus. The screens around the room flickered to life, and the members of the War Council gasped as they saw what humanity had been building in secret for the past 50 years. Hidden in asteroid fields and gas giant atmospheres and the dark spaces between stars where no one thought to look. 200 Dreadnought-class warships, each one 5 kilometers long and bristling with weapons that the Council could not even imagine. Antimatter lances that could punch through planetary shields, quantum disruptors that could tear holes in the fabric of space itself, and planet-cracking ordnance that could reduce entire worlds to rubble in a matter of hours. The Council thinks we are primitives, Admiral Okonkwo said, a grim smile crossing his face. They think we are weak because we are young, because we have only been traveling between stars for a century, because we still fight among ourselves over ideas and beliefs. But they have forgotten something important, something that every species in this galaxy should have learned before they decided to make us their enemy. He stepped closer to the screen, his eyes fixed on the image of humanity's hidden fleet. We are the children of a death world, a planet of supervolcanoes and ice ages and mass extinctions, a world where the weak die and the strong survive. And we have been fighting for our existence since the moment the first human ancestor climbed down from the trees and looked up at the stars. And we have never, not once in all our long and bloody history, stopped preparing for war. 3 days later, President Catherine Moreau addressed the people of Earth and every human colony across the stars. Her image broadcast to billions of screens as she stood before the flag of the United Terran Federation with the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders. She did not cry, and she did not yell, and when she spoke, Her voice was like frozen iron, cold and hard and utterly unbreakable. 3 days ago, she said, the Galactic Council executed our ambassador, a woman who came to them with an open hand and a peaceful heart. And they did this not because she had committed any crime, but because they feared what humanity might become, because they could not accept that a young species might one day stand as their equal. She paused, and her eyes seemed to look directly into the soul of every human watching. They have made their choice, and now we make ours. Behind her, the first images of Project Prometheus appeared, and across human space, people watched in awe as they saw the true power that their leaders had been hiding, the strength that had been built in secret against the day when humanity would need to defend itself against a hostile galaxy. We did not want this war, President Moreau continued, but we will not run from it, and we will not beg for peace from those who have shown us nothing but contempt and cruelty. And we will not rest until the galaxy understands that humanity will not be silenced, that humanity will not be conquered, that humanity will not be forgotten. She leaned closer to the camera, and her final words were barely above a whisper. Remember her name. Remember Elena Vasquez, and remember what they did to her. And let that memory fuel the fire that will carry us to victory. The broadcast ended, and across the galaxy, a single word was transmitted on every frequency and in every known language. A word that reached council stations and alien homeworlds and the private chambers of High Arbiter Zeth Kalen himself. A word that humanity had chosen with care and deliberation to serve as both a promise and a warning. The word was obliteration. Zeth Kalen laughed when he heard it, calling it the tantrum of primitives who did not understand the power they were challenging. And his fellow council members laughed with him, confident that humanity's threats were nothing but empty words from a species that did not know its place. They stopped laughing 1 hour later. In that single hour, 17 council outposts along the border of human space went dark, their signals cut off mid-transmission, their defensive stations destroyed so quickly and so completely that no distress call was ever sent. And as the reports came flooding in, the council finally began to understand what they had awakened. High Arbiter Zeth Kalen stared at the tactical display before him, watching as more and more red dots appeared on the map, each one representing a human warship that was moving through council space like a predator stalking its prey. And for the first time in his long life, he felt something he had never experienced before: fear. The humans were coming, and they had not forgotten what the council had done to Elena Vasquez. And they were not interested in negotiation or diplomacy or anything except the complete and total destruction of everyone who had been responsible for her death. The war had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The first 6 months of the war would later be known as the Time of Fire, a period of such complete and devastating destruction that historians would struggle to find words adequate to describe what humanity had unleashed upon the galaxy. And those who lived through it would carry the memories with them until the day they died. Admiral James Okonkwo led the first fleet from the bridge of his flagship, the dreadnought Vengeance Absolute, a vessel so massive and so powerful that council commanders, who saw it for the first time, often refused to believe their sensors. Convinced that no species could build something so terrifying, the humans did not fight like any enemy the council had ever faced. And this was perhaps the greatest shock of all to species that had been waging war according to the same rules and traditions for thousands of years. Expecting their opponents to do the same, council fleets fought in elaborate formations that had been developed over millennia, following codes of honor and engagement that determined when and how battles should be conducted, with clear signals for surrender and negotiation, and with the understanding that some things were simply not done in civilized warfare. Humanity had no such rules. They attacked without warning and without mercy, striking from unexpected directions with tactics that seemed to change from battle to battle, never following the same pattern twice, never giving their enemies time to adapt or prepare. And they showed no interest in surrender or negotiation or anything except the complete annihilation of every vessel that opposed them. Battle of Nexer Prime was the first major engagement of the war, and it set the tone for everything that would follow, teaching the Council a lesson that they would never forget. The Council had gathered a fleet of 500 warships at Nexer Prime, a massive force that represented the combined military might of a dozen species, and they had positioned themselves in a defensive formation around the system's main planet. Confident that no enemy could break through such overwhelming numbers, 80 Terran ships dropped out of hyperspace on the edge of the system. Council commanders laughed at first, believing that the humans had made a tactical error, that they had underestimated the size of the defending fleet, and they began to broadcast demands for surrender, offering mercy to the primitives if they would simply lay down their weapons and accept their defeat. Humans did not respond instead. They accelerated toward the Council formation at speeds that should have been impossible, their ships weaving and dancing through space in patterns that no targeting computer could predict. And as they closed the distance, they began to fire antimatter lances, tore through Council shields like they were made of paper. Quantum disruptors ripped holes in the hulls of vessels that had been considered invulnerable, and missiles carrying warheads of unimaginable destructive power streaked across the void to find their targets with deadly precision. Battle lasted 11 minutes when it was over. The entire Council fleet had been reduced to debris, 500 ships destroyed with such speed and efficiency that many of them had not even had time to return fire, and the 80 Terran vessels regrouped and continued on their course without pausing to survey the destruction they had left behind. They did not take prisoners' word of the Battle of Nexer Prime spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and for the first time, the species of the Council began to understand what they were truly facing, a realization that brought with it a terror that many of them had never known before. The humans were not fighting to conquer territory, or to gain resources, or to achieve any of the normal goals that species went to war for. They were fighting for one reason and one reason only, and that reason was vengeance. Pure and simple and utterly unstoppable. As the weeks turned into months, the cracks in the Council began to show, and species that had been united under Vorthani leadership for thousands of years began to question whether they wanted to continue fighting a war that they could not win the Kelvari. Collective was the first to break ranks, sending secret messages to Admiral Okonkwo, offering intelligence and safe passage through their territory in exchange for being spared from human wrath. And the Morvathi Union soon followed, revealing that they had been oppressed by the Vorthani for centuries and saw humanity as potential liberators rather than enemies. Colin responded to these betrayals with fury, ordering his remaining loyal forces to launch strikes against human colony worlds, believing that if he could kill enough civilians, he could break humanity's will to fight and force them to the negotiating table. Was wrong. The attacks killed millions of innocent people, men and women and children who had done nothing except be born human. And when the news reached Earth and the other colony worlds, something changed in the hearts of those who had been watching the war from afar. Be a fox. There had been voices calling for peace, arguing that humanity had proven its point and should seek a diplomatic solution before more lives were lost on both sides. But after the attacks, those voices fell silent, and in their place rose a chorus of rage that demanded not just victory, but complete and total destruction of everyone. Responsible President Moreau authorized the activation of the Second and Third Fleets, and the number of Terran warships operating in Council space tripled overnight. And with them came a new intensity to the human offensive, a fury that burned away whatever restraint the military commanders had been exercising. A captured Council commander was brought before Admiral Okonkwo, in the final days of the 6th month, a high-ranking officer from one of the species still loyal to the Vorthani, and he was desperate to understand what was happening, to find some way to end the nightmare that had consumed his people. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. "Please, just tell us what you want, and we will give it to you. Territory, resources, technology, anything. Just tell us what will make you stop this madness." Admiral Okonkwo looked at the alien for a long moment, his dark eyes showing no emotion, no mercy, and no hint that he felt anything at all for the creature standing before him. "We told you what we wanted," he said finally, his voice as cold as the void between stars. "We sent you a single word, broadcast on every frequency in every language. And that word was our answer to everything you are asking me now." He leaned forward, and his next words were barely above a whisper. "You should have listened." The captured commander was returned to his people the next day, carrying with him a message for High Arbiter Zeth Kalan and the remaining Council loyalists. A message that made clear in no uncertain terms that humanity had not forgotten what had been done to Elena Vasquez, and that the price for her death would be paid in full. No matter how long it took or how many lives it cost, the war continued. And with each passing day, the Council's position grew more desperate. Their fleets shattered, their alliances crumbling, and their hope fading like stars at the end of the universe. And still the humans came, relentless and unstoppable, driven by a grief and a rage that the galaxy had never seen before. And High Arbiter Zeth Kalan began to understand at last that he had not killed an ambassador when he ordered Elena Vasquez's execution. He had killed a symbol. And in doing so, he had given humanity something more powerful than any weapon ever created. He had given them a reason to fight, and they would not stop until their fight was finished. 1 year after the execution of Ambassador Elena Vasquez, the human fleet arrived at the heart of Council space, and the beings who had once laughed at humanity's single-word declaration of war now watched in terrified silence as the instruments of their destruction gathered in the darkness above their most sacred station. The eternal accord had stood for 12,000 years as a symbol of Council power and unity, a massive structure that served as the political and spiritual center of galactic civilization, home to 80 million souls from dozens of different species. And no enemy had ever come close to threatening it in all that time. Till now 12 Council species had already surrendered unconditionally to humanity. Their governments dissolved, and their fleets incorporated into the growing alliance of former enemies who had chosen to stand with the humans rather than against them. And 15 more had declared neutrality, pulling their forces back to their home systems and praying that the human storm would pass them by. Only the Vorthani, Dominion, and a handful of loyal client species remained. Their forces gathered around the eternal accord in a desperate final stand. Over 2,000 warships forming a defensive sphere around the station that had been the center of their universe for longer than most species had existed. High Arbiter Zeth Kalan stood on the command bridge of his personal flagship, watching the tactical displays as the human fleet emerged from hyperspace on the edge of the system. And even now, even after a year of defeats and losses, he could not quite believe what he was seeing. The humans had brought everything. The first, second, and third fleets were all present. Hundreds of dreadnoughts and battleships and cruisers arranged in attack formation. But at the center of the human armada was something that made even Zeth Kalan's ancient heart skip a beat. Something that should not have been possible for any species to build. They called it the Hammer of Terra, a mobile battle station the size of a small moon, its surface covered with weapons platforms and launch bays and defensive systems that made it look less like a space station and more like a mechanical god of war that had descended from some higher plane to pass judgment on the mortal beings below. All ships, prepare to engage, Seth Kalen commanded, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his chest. This is our final stand. Our chance to show the galaxy that the Council will not fall without a fight. And I expect every one of you to do your duty. The battle began at dawn, measured by the station's internal clocks, and it would rage for 9 days without pause. The largest naval engagement in the recorded history of the galaxy. A conflict so massive and so violent that the light from its explosions could be seen from neighboring star systems human. Ships dove into the Council formation with the same terrifying aggression they had shown throughout the war. But this time, the defenders were fighting for their very existence. And they met the attack with a determination born of desperation, knowing that if they fell, everything they had built over 12,000 years would fall with them. The first 3 days saw the heaviest losses on both sides, as the two fleets crashed together in chaos of weapons fire and debris, ships dying by the dozen as they fought for every kilometer of space. And for a brief moment, it seemed as if the Council might actually hold, might actually find a way to stop the human advance. But the humans did not stop. They could not stop. Not now, not after everything they had sacrificed to reach this moment. And even as their ships burned and their crews died, they pressed forward, driven by a fire that the Council had never understood and could never extinguish. Admiral Okonkwo directed the battle from the bridge of the Vengeance Absolute, his commands calm and precise, even as the deck shook from enemy fire. And when one of his officers reported that their losses had reached 40%, he simply nodded and ordered the remaining ships to close the gap. "We did not come here to retreat," he said. "We came here to end this." By the 6th day, the Council's outer defensive line had collapsed, and the human fleet was engaged in close combat with the ships protecting the station itself. And the fighting became so intense that vessels on both sides were ramming into each other when their weapons ran dry, their crews choosing death over surrender. On the 7th day, the Hammer of Terra opened fire for the first time. Its main weapon was something that human scientists had spent decades developing, a focused beam of compressed antimatter that could slice through any known material like a blade through water. And when it struck the largest Council battleship in the defensive line, the vessel simply ceased to exist, vanishing in a flash of light so bright that sensors across the system were temporarily blinded. Council's will to fight began to break after that ship started to flee, their captains abandoning their positions and making desperate runs for open space, hoping to escape before the human weapon could target them. And as the defensive line crumbled, the station itself lay exposed before the human fleet. Sith Colin watched from his flagship as his forces melted away, his black eyes wide with disbelief. And when his first officer suggested that they retreat while there was still time, the High Arbiter turned on him with fury in his voice. "We do not retreat," he snarled. "We are the Council. We are the rulers of this galaxy. And we do not run from primitives." But even as he spoke, his flagship shuddered under multiple impacts, and warning alarms began to scream throughout the ship. And Seth Kalen knew in his heart that the battle was lost, that everything he had worked for was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. On the 9th day, the Terran Marines boarded the Eternal Accord. They came in waves, thousands of soldiers in powered armor flooding through the docking bays and corridors of the station. And the Council defenders who stood against them discovered that humans were just as terrifying in close combat as they were in space, relentless and efficient, and utterly without mercy for those who resisted. But the Marines did not burn the station, and they did not slaughter the civilians who cowered in their homes. And this surprised everyone who had expected humanity to repay cruelty with cruelty. Instead, they were surgically precise, targeting only military installations and government buildings. And when they encountered non-combatants, they simply told them to stay inside and wait for the fighting to end. Admiral Okondo broadcast a message to the galaxy as his Marines secured the station, his voice carrying to every world that was watching the fall of the Council. "We are not monsters," he said. "We are humanity, and we came to this galaxy in peace, offering friendship and alliance to anyone who would accept us. And the Council answered our offer with murder and contempt. And this is the consequence of their choice." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less powerful. "But we will not become what they feared. We will not prove them right by committing atrocities in the name of vengeance. And when this war is over, we will build something better from the ashes of what we have destroyed." Zeth Kalen was found 3 hours later, hiding in his private chambers beneath the council hall, his ancient body trembling with fear as human soldiers surrounded him, their weapons pointed at the being who had ordered the death of Ambassador Elena Vasquez and started a war that had cost millions of lives. The soldiers did not kill him. Instead, they placed him in restraints and led him through the corridors of the station he had once ruled, past the bodies of his defenders and the ruins of his power. And when they emerged into the main plaza, where Elena Vasquez had been executed 1 year ago, Zeth Kalen saw the human fleet through the transparent dome above, their ships hanging in space like wolves watching their prey. The war was over, but humanity was not finished yet. 1 month after the fall of the Eternal Accord, the galaxy watched as High Arbiter Zeth Kalen was led into the Great Hall where he had once sat in judgment over the fate of entire species, his ancient body wrapped in the plain gray robes of a prisoner, his black eyes staring straight ahead as if he could not quite believe what was happening to him. The trial was broadcast across every world in the galaxy, viewed by trillions of beings who had spent their entire lives under council rule and were now witnessing something they had never thought possible. The leaders of that same council being held accountable for their crimes by a species that had been dismissed as primitives barely a year ago. Zeth Kalen was charged with the murder of Ambassador Elena Vasquez, with the genocide of human civilians on colony worlds, and with countless other crimes against sentient beings that had been committed under his authority during his long reign as High Arbiter. And the evidence against him was overwhelming and undeniable. Human prosecutors presented recordings of his orders and testimony from witnesses who had been present at Elena's execution, and species that had suffered under Vorthani rule for centuries came forward to add their own accusations to the list, revealing horrors that the Council had kept hidden from the wider galaxy for thousands of years. When Zeth Kalen was given the chance to speak in his own defense, he remained silent for a long time, his eyes moving across the faces of those who had gathered to witness his judgment. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I did what I believed was necessary to preserve order in the galaxy," he said. "And if I had to make the same choice again, I would not hesitate, because the Council was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos, and humanity was a threat that had to be eliminated before it could destroy everything we had built." He looked directly at President Catherine Moreau, who sat among the human delegation with the same cold expression she had worn on the day she declared war. "You think you have won," he continued, "but you have only destroyed the foundations of galactic society. And when the Void Reapers come, and they will come, you will have no one to stand beside you, no one to help you fight against an enemy that has been devouring civilizations since before the first star in this galaxy was born." President Moreau rose from her seat and walked toward the prisoner, her footsteps echoing in the silent hall. And when she stood before him, she spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. "You are wrong," she said, "about so many things, but most of all, you are wrong about humanity. Because we did not come here to destroy civilization. We came here to save it from those like you who had turned it into a tool of oppression and cruelty. She gestured toward the viewing galleries, where representatives of dozens of species sat watching the trial. Species that had been conquered and exploited and dismissed by the Council for longer than humanity had existed. "These are our allies now," she continued. "And when the Void Reapers come, we will stand together, not as masters and slaves, but as equals. And we will show them and the entire universe that the galaxy is no longer ruled by fear." The verdict was unanimous, and Zeph Kalen was found guilty of all charges. But what happened next shocked everyone who had expected humanity to demand his execution. President Moreau stood before the galaxy once more and announced that Zeph Kalen would not be put to death, that humanity had not fought this war to become the same kind of tyrants they had overthrown, and that true justice was not about revenge, but about ensuring that the horrors of the past would never be repeated. "We are not what you made us become," she said, her eyes meeting Zeph Kalen's. "We are what we choose to be, and we choose to be better than those who came before us." The former High Arbiter was sentenced to life imprisonment, confined to a small cell where he would spend his remaining centuries cataloging every name and every life that had been lost in the war he had started. A living monument to the cost of cruelty and the price of underestimating those you consider beneath you. In the weeks that followed, the Galactic Council was formally dissolved, its institutions dismantled, and its laws rewritten. And in its place, humanity proposed a new form of government, one that had never been tried before on a galactic scale. They called it the Galactic Assembly, and it was built on principles that the old Council would have considered dangerous and naive: true equal representation for every species, protection for emerging civilizations, and strict laws against the kind of atrocities that had defined Council rule for 12,000 years. The species that had been oppressed under the old order embraced humanity as liberators, and former enemies became the strongest allies, bound together by shared suffering in the hope that the future would be different from the past. And as the months passed and the assembly began to take shape, it became clear that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy's humanity had not just won a war. They had transformed the entire nature of galactic civilization. 1 year after the trial of Zeph Kalen, a memorial was erected at the site where Ambassador Elena Vasquez had been executed. A towering statue of bronze and steel that depicted her standing tall with her hand outstretched, the same gesture of peace and friendship that she had offered the Council on the day they killed her. The station had been renamed Unity, and it now served as the capital of the Galactic Assembly, a symbol of the new order that humanity had built from the ashes of the old. And beings from every corner of the galaxy came to see the memorial and pay their respects to the woman whose death had changed everything. The inscription at the base of the statue read, "She came with an open hand. We returned with a closed fist." May the galaxy never forget the cost of cruelty, nor the power of mercy. Admiral James Okonkwo visited the memorial alone on a quiet evening when the crowds had gone and the halls were empty, his footsteps echoing in the silence as he walked toward the statue and looked up at the face of the woman he had never met, but had spent a year avenging. He was older now, his hair touched with gray, and his eyes carrying the weight of everything he had seen and done during the war. And as he stood before Elena's image, he thought about all the lives that had been lost, human and alien alike, and wondered if it had been worth it. Then he remembered the broadcasts from Council space, the messages of gratitude from species that had been freed from Vorthani oppression, the children on a dozen worlds who would grow up in a galaxy where no one would be executed for offering peace. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single flower from Earth, a red rose that he had carried with him across the stars, and he placed it gently at the base of the statue. "He remembered you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like you asked us to." He stood there for a long moment, watching as the artificial light of the station played across the bronze features of Elena Vasquez's face, and then he turned and walked away, leaving the flower behind as a promise that humanity would never forget what had been done in her name. Outside, the stars burned bright against the endless darkness of space, and somewhere out there, in the vast reaches of the galaxy, a new era was beginning, an era of hope and unity, and the promise that the future could be different from the past. Humanity had come to the stars with an open hand, and though they had been forced to close that hand into a fist, they had never forgotten who they truly were, and they never would. The galaxy watched humanity now with different eyes, not with contempt or fear, but with awe and gratitude, and perhaps, for the first time in 12,000 years, with understanding. They had learned the cost of underestimating humanity, and they would never make that mistake again.